Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, when shit hits the fan, your best interest is to turn off the fan as soon as possible and clean it up before it flies all over the place, like in your food and in your face. This debate is not about whether or not bailouts are good or bad, but who calls for it to happen, who takes the initiative, and who leads the process. We recognize that bailouts are very complicated and there are many visceral realities, which is why they are very different case to case and accordingly also have to be dealt with case to case. We believe that the US Federal Bank, the Federal Reserve, or the Fed for short, be the one to be able to lead bailouts as opposed to the comparative on side opposition, which is the legislative branch. This is often a function of the lower house in Congress and the Senate in the upper house, both of which are needed in order to have a bipartisan consensus to do things like pass laws. We recognize that there may be instances where the president or the executive office can kind of push the legislative branch to be able to do things faster, but more often than not, these still take really, really long, and as a consequence are not enough, especially if we want to be proactive as opposed to be reactive in terms of dealing with these crises. Why is it the case? 3 reasons. The first is the expediency of decision making, given market panic and speculation, is able to prevent contagion, prevent worldwide and domestic panic, which often happens when a particular key industry, often a bank or a financial sector, is going under. That is to say, it's in our interest to be able to stop the bleeding and prevent things from being worse, because at the point in which it hits an inflection point, people start panicking and a lot of bad things happen. That's quite intuitive. Secondly, is in terms of proximate access to liquidity and capital. That is to say, the Federal Reserve, who is able to control M2 or money supply of the market, is literally able to print out money to be able to solve liquidity. I'll make out later in my speech why that won't lead to inflation, which is something that opposition rightfully can question. For real, I'll answer it later. Third is in terms of influence in the world. The Federal Reserve and US Bank is the most important financial institution given the spheres of influence they have on the US dollar, the world's reserve currency, but more importantly on the TNX or the US 10-year Treasury, which serves as the interest rate benchmark for overnight lending for everybody. That is to say, whether it be a foreign debt or whether it be your own credit card, these are largely dictated by the Federal Reserve, and lots of central banks around the world have to be able to listen. Why is the Federal Reserve better? And what's the legislative comparative? And why is that just worse? Number 1, during instances of extreme market panic, individual and institutional investors often react irrationally. They often refer to this in finance as irrational exuberance or animal spirits. And they start doing things like selling assets like stocks and bonds, or even actively taking levered positions on margin when they short or go against that particular institution, making it even more volatile to things like short covering. Think like what happened with GME and how so many different retail and institutional investors got absolutely fucked. The goal of this is to be able to stop the bleeding, and we think the best way to stop the bleeding is not to wait for someone to come or wait for someone who is in politics to figure it out, but be able to do it right away. The intuition pump is being able to take out the tumor at stage 1 as opposed to letting it go on to stage 4. Yes, it's still possible, but bad things are likely to happen. We think we have to understand bailouts in and of itself are of last resort. Again, this debate is not about whether or not we should do it, but who should lead it. This is similar to financial crises in the past. Let me contextualize. In 2008, US banks like Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, and Lehman Brothers largely went under. Yes, there was a bailout, but this was too late already at the point in which the subprime bubble had already exploded, sending not just America and those institutions bankrupt, but contagion and panic to the rest of the world. This is as opposed to what happened in March of 2003 when the US Federal Reserve given the crisis we had with Silicon Valley Investment Bank and Signature Bank, actually had the Fed call for the BTFD, or the Bank Term Funding Program. This is me proving our case. They bailed out these particular banks by allowing them to be able to borrow short-term loans using collateral, such as the US Treasuries, of which the federal bank has a relationship with the Treasury. This is the whole Jerome Powell and Yellen kind of relationship, in order to be able to access particular debt and mortgage-backed securities. What did the Fed then do? They valued this collateral at par and allowed them to be able to borrow more at the point in which it was conditional and they had a short-term window to do it. CEO, go for it.
Yeah, you still don't explain why inflation does not happen in most cases when you go for these bailouts. If you increase the liquidity, the amount of asset purchasability, etc. increases. It's just a perceived demand as opposed to actual.
Yeah, if opposition's main case is inflation, they have to go back to Econ 101, wherein the whole point of the fucking Fed is to rein in on inflation. Inflation going high or low is fine. It's a matter of keeping it within an acceptable bandwidth. There are 3 structural reasons in terms of inflation not happening. This is my direct response to the POI. The first is the Fed being able to literally influence interest rates, bringing it high or low to be able to expand or contract money supply directly. The second is their influence on reserve requirements for overnight lending. That is to say, if they want to expand or contract, move that accordingly. The third is direct access to open market operations and influence over the Treasury, where they can literally buy or sell securities, again, to be able to expand or contract the market. If the hill opposition side is going to die on is on inflation, I've preempted that from the start. The comparative against legislative-driven approaches is very simple. It's contingent on bipartisan consensus, and it ultimately takes far too long, even if they're motivated by a medium or long-term intention. Everything that they say about long-term sustainability comes a priori, and we come before that, because everything that they say is actually a function of us being able to stop the bleeding. What's the point of going long-term if you're dead and things are in shambles? With that, we are very proud to open this debate.